All right, so hopefully you're all here to see me talk about Desire State Configuration v3 next generation. Otherwise, you can still stay. But good morning. Go through the sponsors real quick. Thank you. All right, so let me just give a quick introduction to myself if you don't know me. I'm the engineer manager for, well, I list a bunch of things here, but basically PowerShell, DCv3, the Windows port of OpenSSH, PowerShell Gallery, VS Code extension, a bunch of modules and all this stuff. So again, if you see me on the floor later on, you can ask me about any of these questions. I'm more than happy to talk about it. But right now, we're going to talk about Desire State Configuration. So we're going to start with just a brief history lesson, not specific about DSC, but just about configuration. So at the beginning, and many of you may have lived through this, configuration of servers and whatnot was a very manual process. You can kind of see there's sticky notes where people keep secrets. Is mainly tailored towards single systems, so not at scale. It was very fragile. Again, with like the sticky notes, people had to have like tribal knowledge, so things were not shared very easily. But then things move forward, and people discover scripting. Of course, this is ISC. However, with scripting, you still have certain problems. Like you have inconsistency across different people writing scripts. You had errors, so things were not handled the same way. Things could fail. And also scripts tended to be really large and huge and hard to maintain. So then as the IT world matured, you move towards configuration as code, right? So this becomes a more declarative model. This is a shifting of the complexities from having these large scripts to having all this knowledge within the resources. You focus on defining declared state that you want versus having imperative scripts. And then out of all that came DSC. So this is DSCv1, very early on. Right, so from my point of view, it's still very simple. So V1 for Desire State Configuration, if you're not familiar, this was very Windows focused. So there was very limited Linux support. There's this other project called MMI. I won't get into it here unless you really want me to talk about it. There's a concept of a local configuration manager, LCM. And initially, V1 supported what we call native resources written in WMI as a WMI class. This is mainly a lot of the built-in resources in Windows. You could also write DC resources in PowerShell script. And of course, we also essentially move forward with PowerShell classes specifically to support DSC. And those of you familiar with Desire State Configuration know about get, set, and test. And the other thing is because of the connection to WMI, which just so you know, like I was part of the WMI team for a very long time. First release was on NT4, so that's how old I am. Because of the connection with WMI, it used MOF. So this managed object format came out of the DMTF. You don't need to worry about these details at all, because we'll talk about how we moved away from MOF. All right, so then we went to like the industrial age, which is now DSCv2. All right, and this is where I kind of come in. So all the other stuff before was before my time on the team. So I take no responsibility for any of that stuff. So with V2, this is where we kind of align it with PowerShell Core 6 at the time. We have this, so this kind of predates that, but we kind of made some modifications. So this is where a lot of the knowledge and work is now in the PS Desire State Configuration module. We moved away from an LCM model, partly because that was Windows only, right? So instead we went to like a bring your own agent. So you could actually use Azure guest configuration as your agent, or you could write a PowerShell script, use Task Scheduler, whatever you want. But you needed to bring your own agent. There's no more LCM support. And one of the reasons for that is to make it cross-platform, right? So we aligned it with PowerShell 7. This is where we also made it open source. And the primary means of using this is via the get DSC resource and invoke DSC resource. And this is also where we started thinking about decoupling DSC from PowerShell so that the two can evolve independently versus being tied together. All right, so here we are, the future. Partly because it hasn't, it's in preview, but it hasn't shipped in GA yet, and I'll talk about that later. So one of the things to keep in mind is DCv3 is not just an evolutionary step of Desire State Configuration. This is actually completely rethinking of what DSC should be, especially in the modern age, which also means that there's a lot of incompatibilities, but we'll get to that in a bit. It is from its inception cross-platform and open source. It is completely separate from PowerShell, although you can still use PowerShell, and I will show some of that later. As I mentioned, both Windows PowerShell 5.1 and PowerShell 7 are both supported for resources. But the key thing here is, and one of the main motivators for moving forward with DSCv3 is the question, can we actually build a bigger ecosystem and enable our partners and our customers to build resources in any language? When I say any language, it could be JavaScript, it could be Python, C#, whatever the developer wants, right? So we moved away from just having purely PowerShell. I'm going to exclude WMI, PowerShell authored resources. No one really built WMI resources except for Microsoft. And finally, no more MOF. We're moving towards JSON. I'm not a huge fan of JSON personally, but it is what the industry has adopted. There's a bunch of tooling. Every language pretty much has like a parser. There's no reason to invent something new here. And we have new verbs or operations, if you will, like export, and I'll get into all these details later. So I'm going to get into, so the remainder of this talk is actually going to be just basically demos. All right, I'm going to start showing things working. This is just a high-level outline of what I'm going to show. So I'm going to talk about the anatomy of a V3 resource. A lot of the operations of DSCv3 is going to be through the DSC executable today. We're going to talk about configuration documents. So these will look very different from using the configuration keyword generated on a MOF file. We're going to show how to use PowerShell-based resources, a Linux example, and a Windows example. Actually, it's fine. Actually, I might show a Mac OS example instead of Linux. I should have updated that. All right. So let's jump in here. And because we have such a large, I think, amount of time, I do encourage folks to ask questions during this part of the session if you need more clarification, because it's somewhat clear in my mind as I'm presenting it, but it may not be most obvious. So please raise your hand and feel free to ask questions. All right, so let's make this. Okay, so this is just VS Code. And you'll see, because I have a lot of content up here, I'm going to use this Markdown doc to remind myself the different parts of the demo. So the first thing here is, actually, I should have got this ready. This is not the right, this is my OpenSSH repo. So first, let me tell you how you can get DSC today, and I will make this bigger. And all right, so this is the open source repo for DSC today under PowerShell DSC. And currently, if you go under releases, then you can download. We're already up to preview 8 right now. You can kind of see there's been a bunch of changes since the last one. I am still in process. I wanted to have it published before PSConfEU. I'm still working on publishing DSCXC for Windows on the Microsoft Store, so you can just easily get it via Winget or just download it from the store. However, I'll just give you the short story. It turns out that if you have a command line tool, then one of the things that store requires, and in fact, I think I have it installed here, so I can show you. This is a requirement I did not know till later after I tried it. Well, you won't find it now, but basically, if you have an app in the store and you install it, there's an open button, right? So one of the manual certification tests that the testers do is they click the open button and they expect to see the app pop up. Because it's a command line tool and requires mandatory parameters, it kind of just disappears. And so they sent me a report that the app crashed. And I was like, all right, give me a stack trace. I said, we don't have it. It's like, well, what happens? So they told me what happened. And basically, I have an issue open, so I need to fix it later, which is if I know the parent process is either Explorer XE or the store, I'll have to just have a prompt and tell the user, this is a command line tool. And then I can pass certification. So a note to anyone else building command line tools to publish store, you have to do something similar. If you want it public. It is actually in the store, but it's not listed, so you can't find it. So the question is about Winget. Yes. Well, Demetrius isn't back.
So you can explain it. I'll let you repeat that. The store publishing failure is my fault.
So Demetrius is a PM on the Winget side. He's claiming that he is at fault for this requirement, I guess.
When we do validation for a command line, if we don't get an exit 0 when we call with no we have to know ahead of time what to put in.
Okay, so basically saying that when you run the command line tool from the store and it doesn't have a 0 is considered success. Anything non-0 is generally considered a failure. And because DSC requires mandatory, it returns a non-0 execute with help content, right? It's like, for example, I can just run it here. So you can see it tells you a bunch of stuff. And last exit code, right? This is a 2. So then certification says this is a failure. So anyways, I'll get that fixed later on, all right, to make it easier. But for now, if you go to the GitHub page, you can find a zip package for Windows and tar gz packages for Mac OS and Linux for both x64 and ARM64, and try it out in open issues. All right, so let's get to some of these things. So again, you can kind of see there's the main entry point right now is this DSC executable, and it works the same across the different platforms. For example, if I just run list, you can kind of see right now these are the resources I have on this particular system that I built. And you can also see this is a table view. So this is not, how should I put it? It's not being formatted by PowerShell. This is actually being formatted by the DC tool itself. Let's see. And the other thing that you'll see is here for under kind, and we'll talk more about the details of what these kind things mean, but there's adapter kinds, all right? And this is how we integrate with PowerShell. And in the future, if someone else wanted to write an adapter for Node or for Python, they could also do that as well. We're probably not going to do it. But basically, if I want to see all the resources for PowerShell on my system, right, then by default, by default, we're not going to recursively go into the adapters to list out the resources, because then everything would just scroll off your screen all the time. In fact, you can kind of see also we have a adapter for WMI, and WMI on at least this system has like over, I think, 8,000 WMI classes, so everything just fall off. But these are the ones I have installed right now. And in fact, we have two separate adapters for Windows PowerShell 5.1 and also PowerShell 7. So this first one is PowerShell 7, the second one is 5.1. And let me just show the WMI one real quick here to kind of give you an idea how this works. All right, use the cursor since the mouse. So you can also do like wildcards to kind of limit the output. So I'm just going to find any WMI classes that have obviously computer in them. And if you're familiar with WMI, then some of these classes should be familiar to you. Right now, I'll just mention, WMI is experimental right now. We're trying to figure out how this will work with adapters. So you can only do gets right now with WMI, but I have an issue open already on how we can do a sets, and also a lot of WMI capabilities exposed through methods. So we got to figure out how to expose that as well. All right. So I kind of showed this already, but I'll show this as well. This is for finding resources. So again, you can just put in wildcards. Now, of course, I don't have too many DSCv3 resources today, and hopefully that will grow over time. But you can find, this is finding anything that has a DSC in front. And one of the things I'll mention is we're starting with the convention of having basically a namespace in front with a slash and then kind of like your noun, if you will, right? That way, if other companies or customers have their own, let's say, group resource, and I'll talk about what a group resource is later, they can have their own namespace, so there's no collision. You can use these simultaneously. Obviously, anything that comes with Microsoft will be from Microsoft. All right, and then, so here's just another example of PowerShell-based resources. Oh, actually, in this case, I don't have PSDSC resources installed. So nothing got returned. Okay, so let's now, so that's kind of like just finding resources. Again, these are only ones installed in a system. We don't have a mechanism today to find resources that are published elsewhere. That's going to come later. And I think I'll talk more about that later in a bit, or towards the end. So let's actually use one of these resources that I have on the system here. So similar to PSDSC module, you do invoke DC resource. You can actually invoke a resource directly using DC resource with an operation. So I'm going to do get here. There is a Microsoft OS info resource that I wrote that works across the Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. And then because this is now searching across the Windows PowerShell, this is telling me that this is not going to work. So what did I do wrong? It's probably because this is actually Microsoft DSC, I think is the problem. Hold on, I will figure. So this, this is live because things are not working the way I expect. All right, I'm going to stop that. This is where I thought I had tested everything. All right, let's list it again. Oh, it's not actually here. Let me try doing another build real quick.
Those resources, are they embedded into DSCv3?
They are not. I'll go into that in a bit. There's a whole concept. The question is, are these resources actually part of DSCx itself? I'm assuming, right? So they're not. These are not built in that sense. They are built in the sense that they're shipped with DSCx as a package. But I'll go into how this gets discovered in a bit. Okay. Shouldn't take too long. So while this is building, I'll mention like everything in most everything in DSCv3 today, at least the core engine is actually written in Rust. And if you're not familiar with Rust, it's kind of like a C type of language, emits system level native code. And the reason for that is we do want to run in certain environments that don't necessarily support or allow like .NET Framework or .NET to run. All right, so if I did this right, I should see the OS info resource. Okay, you can see a lot more stuff now. And you can ignore these test ones. These are ones that we built as part of the repo to test our stuff, right? So if I do the DSC resource get, now it should find it. And it's just going to emit very simple operating system information. Again, this is the OS info resource. I don't think we will intend to necessarily, we may ship it or not, but it's not intended to be full featured, right? So this is, again, more of a test that we use to validate that certain things are working. The OS info resource is also written in Rust as an early validation of the model. So you see I'm running Windows 11. This is a x86-64 system. And I can also run a test here to kind of show you what the output looks like. In fact, I'll just change this to test. And then, all right, maybe I'll show you early on something because I need to figure out why. Let's do debug. So there's a -L to give you more tracing. How did things break? No, something wrong with the JSON, with the DSC resource test. All right, I'll have to figure that out later. Hopefully my other demos aren't going to break. But let me go back to this real quick. So one of the things you may notice, like if I run this, it's actually emitting, this is YAML, right? If you're familiar with it, and it's actually syntax colored. So it's actually, so DSCx works, how do I put this? So the common format to exchange, as I mentioned earlier, is JSON. Okay. However, we do support YAML input because YAML allows you to have comments. JSON-C is not supported. And it's actually a little bit more human readable in my mind because you don't have all these braces and quotes everywhere, right? However, the output of DSCx is actually natively JSON. However, if we know that you're not piping it to something else, then by default, we'll actually emit YAML because it's more human readable. So if I were to pipe this to, what do I have? I don't think, I'm not using Windows as much as I used to. Okay. So if I pipe it to more, then you can kind of see the actual raw output that actually comes out of the tool. However, you can always specify here, like, YAML is not going to be interesting because it's going to be YAML, but I can do JSON, and it will be syntax color only because it knows it's not being piped to something else. But I also do pretty JSON, and it's a little bit easier to read, but again, I don't recommend reading JSON on a day-to-day basis. I kind of showed a bit about tracing. So when things fail, like the test one, I'll run it again just because I know it's failing now for some reason. So by default, we actually use the error level. When I say error level, I mean the error tracing level. So if I were to actually just run this, let me get rid of the rest of this line here. So we do have good command line help, right? So if I do that, then it tells me that the trace level is not specified. You can do error, warn, info, debug, and trace. Info is kind of like PowerShell's verbose, is the way to think about it. And one of the conventions that we actually define within the DC team is that you should not use trace by default because trace will emit raw JSON input and output, which may contain sensitive information. All right. So you should really only use that manually and not in like CI/CD. You should only go to debug at most. But again, if I go back here, so if I just do error, then you won't see much info on what the problem is. Again, it's complaining that JSON is finishing before is expected. And I'm not sure right now why that's the case. But if you go to trace, maybe this will actually inform me. because I should see the raw output. So standard out return. I mean, this JSON looks fine to me, so there's some other problem. But basically, for this purpose of this explanation, you can kind of see like you'll be able to see if I scroll up like the raw inputs and outputs. There's no input in this case, but you can also see like how it's finding the different resources and that. So there's a lot of information in here that will help you or a developer troubleshoot what's going on. What if? All right. So one of the features that we wanted to have is if you want to do a set. So actually, I'm not sure why I have this in this section. It should be later. But I'll get to it now since I have it. Actually, let me. So if you guys saw the state of the shell, I showed the winget integration demo. So let me run that one because I can use a what if on that. So -p just gives you a path to the example. So I don't want to use wmy here. Right. So this is just again, this is not any different from what I showed, but basically. I will show you the YAML here. Let's get rid of this. And I'll spend a bit more time explaining this now. So again, for DSCv3, we don't have moff or a configuration keyword, but we do have JSON YAML, or kind of you can think of it as interchangeable. Just the formatting is different, if you will. And we have a schema defined. This will also be how we manage versioning. And ignore parameters. I'll cover that later. But basically in this, I'm specifying a couple of resources, and these are PowerShell-based resources. So I mentioned earlier, there's a PowerShell adapter. So one of the benefits of having this adapter concept is that we can actually just have one instance of, in this case, PWSH-exe to actually use all the resources. We're not spawning multiple instances of PWSH. And in this case, we're going to use the winget package resource. This is a PowerShell class-based resource twice. One to check if we have PowerShell 7 preview installed, and another whether or not we have, so this identifier is actually the store version of calc. Again, ignore this parameters for now. But if I go back to the output here, that should be off screen. You can kind of see a lot of information gets returned from winget. So it tells me that PowerShell 7 is installed true here, but also tells me that versions installed, but it tells me that all these other versions that we've published are available. And for calc, it currently is installed. So if I run calc, it should pop up. So let me uninstall it for now. Let's see if I have. Yep. All right. So let me run this. Oh, this is get. Let me stop that. I need to do set. Or actually, I can just do what if here. So I think it's just W. Oh, I promise you these things were working prior. All right, so let me explain, and maybe I can figure out why this isn't working. So basically, what if you're not familiar with DSCv2 or PowerShell, rather than doing an actual set, so this set will apply the configuration, it should tell you what will change, right? So we have two levels of what if here. One is within the engine itself, so it's synthetic, and then one at the resource level, which I don't have in the latest build yet to demo. We have a pull request that's open to update the registry resource to support what if. But the idea here is that before you actually apply the configuration, if the resource itself doesn't support the what if operation, then the DC engine will say, all right, here's your desired state. Let's say it's A, and it'll get the current state, which is B, and it'll just basically just say, hey, A is going to be changed to B. All right, that's essentially how it works. And it's going to go through all the resources. Now, if a resource itself supports what if directly, then it actually gets more interesting. So one of the things that we did in the registry resource, again, it's a pull request in progress, so it hasn't been merged in yet. But in the registry resource, we can actually check permissions, right? So if you try to do a set and you try to set A to B, but you actually don't have permission to do it, it can tell you that you don't have permission to do it, so you can actually know ahead of time the reason it's going to fail versus just what might change. And again, I'll go into some details later in a bit on how all that is exposed. Oh, in fact, it's going to be here. So let's go to a manifest. And all the manifests are in. So I'll go to a group manifest and I'll make this bigger. So the way DSCv3 discovers resources is through either an adapter, which I kind of showed earlier, and I'll talk more about the PowerShell adapter later. But for native resources, or rather resources written in other languages, you need to have a resource manifest. And this is written in either JSON or YAML. The example I have here is actually one. So these that you see here, group and include, and I'll talk about include later, are ones that we ship with DSCx3. All right, so these are included as part of the package. In the case of the group resource, and I'll explain in a bit what it does, this actually reuses the DSCx3 itself as the resource. All right. So let me just walk through some of this schema here. So you can kind of see this declares the type name, and again we have the namespace and the noun. There's versioning information. There's some description. I'll talk about kind in a bit, but the way that DSC knows how to do certain operations is through this manifest. So you can kind of see there's a section for get, set, test, and that's it for this particular resource. And basically it tells you what is the executable and what arguments need to be provided. So like what you could do if you wanted to is actually have the executable be PowerShell exe or PWSH and call your script. And in fact, that is how the PowerShell adapter actually works. Let me see, it's right here. So again, we have two adapters. One is Windows PowerShell and one is PowerShell 7. But if we look at the PowerShell 7 one, is literally calling the PWSH exe with a script that one of my engineers wrote that does the actual operation. And if you flip to the Windows PowerShell, then obviously it's going to call PowerShell exe instead of PWSH. And in this case, it's actually using the same script. We just know we have logic inside the script to know whether it's running under PowerShell 7 or Windows PowerShell. Let me see. I can continue with maybe this manifest. So again, you have the different operations. An adapter, again, is a way to kind of have resources in different languages interoperate with DSCv3. So PowerShell is one of those. And again, anyone can build a different adapter. We get set, test, and I think this one also has this thing called validate. So when you have an adapter, the way that DSCv3 validates the schema for a v3 resource is through JSON schema. But with an adapter, we don't necessarily expect, for example, PowerShell to somehow transform a PowerShell class into JSON schema. That's not a easy problem to solve. So instead, we actually have a validate operation, and we just ask the adapter to do the validation for us. So we'll give it JSON, and it'll tell us whether or not it matches. So in the case of the PowerShell adapter, we actually kind of do a comparison of the class schema with the JSON schema, or the JSON input. All right. So schema, speaking of schema, whoops, didn't want to bring that. Let's go back to my terminal. All right, so when you're working with JSON schema, if you need to know the schema for a particular resource, in fact, I'll talk about this one in a bit, you can always run the schema operation. So every resource is required to have JSON schema, a v3 resource. And in fact, if you look, not in that one, but if you look in, close that. If we go back here, right, one of the things down here is, oh, this one also implements validate. Let me find the registry one. Registry. All right, so this is the manifest for the registry. You can kind of see it's a little bit more complicated. And I'll get into some of these other complications later. But there is a schema operation, and it basically there's two ways to specify schema. One is it's going to be a command that you run, and it's going to emit JSON schema as the output. Or you can actually have embedded schema in here. And I think I can show one of our test resources should have that. So I think echo, not this one. Where are you? I think all these are calling command line, but you can also have nested schema inside the JSON file. But if you are developing configuration and you want to know what the schema looks like, so you know what properties you can pass, then you can run a schema operation like I did here for this run command on set, and I'll explain that in a second. and it tells you that it has these arguments or these properties. So it has an argument, executable, and execode. So one of the resources we wrote that kind of helped to transition from, if you remember the history lesson, right? You're going from script to declarative. We do recognize that a large set of customers have existing scripts, right? And these they know, they kind of know work in production, and they don't necessarily have the resources or time to convert all those to resources. So what this resource does, and the reason we call it transitional, is we want to make sure people use this for transition purposes and doesn't, if they're building new stuff, they should generally not use this. But this allows you on a set operation to run an arbitrary command, right? And the arbitrary command could be PowerShell running a script or Python running a script, or whatever the case may be. And this is one that we're shipping. All right. Any questions so far? I know I don't want to. Yes.
So I have actually already a few questions.
Sure.
First one, it looks pretty static compared to PowerShell DSC that we know and love. Do you suppose something like Jinja in the syntax over there or anything like that? Or we just have to generate those YAML files when you want to have like configuration that just kind of changes across different fleet of servers?
Okay, so the question is comparing to DSC, let's say V1, V2, with a permanent configuration keyword, where you can have script to generate the resulting static MOF. So the way it works today, and I'll get more into this in the configuration section of the talk, but basically we do have certain functions and expressions in the configuration to make it a little bit more dynamic so that you can actually adjust it at runtime. However, it is more of a static design than the way PowerShell is designed, but I'll get to something in the end, how we're going to resolve some of that. Good question.
And the question is, like, you have a little schema here that's lying around.
Yes.
Is there like VS Code support for that so we can actually get the syntax?
Sure. All right. So the other question is, there's a lot of JSON schema. Most folks probably don't want to read or deal with JSON schema directly. How are you going to actually author these things with IntelliSense, basically? So again, we don't have it yet today, but there's a couple of things which I'll get into, or I'll just mention. And this is kind of like giving away some of the quote unquote surprise at the end. So we are looking towards bicep integration. No, that's fine. So we are looking towards bicep integration in the future. So that will provide some of this. So you'll use VS Code with bicep, and you'll be able to ideally author in bicep if you prefer bicep and generate a DC configuration. So that's one example. Another thing that we have a experimental proof of concept of is actually if you prefer or if you choose to author in YAML, we have a proof of concept VS Code extension, which I don't have here. It's still an open PR right now, that will allow you to do IntelliSense based on what you have on your system. So if you have resources installed on your system, that extension can discover those, get the schema, get the properties, and you'll get IntelliSense that way. Now, the third way to do it is that because we have all these JSON schemas published in our GitHub repo, as long as you copy and paste that URL into VS Code itself, as you're authoring YAML or JSON, will resolve that, and you'll get a simplified experience that way. But that is something that we are treating as important, but not critical for this first part of the release. All right, so let's get into different resource kinds in a little bit more detail. So a resource is just a simple resource, right? So this is something that has domain knowledge. It could be like a network adapter, firewall rule, whatever the case may be. So this is probably the thing that most people will work with as configuration authors. A group resource. So let me show you, where do I have the examples? So this is a new concept in DSCv3. And again, the way it's implemented is actually reusing DSC itself. But the way to think about a group is it is a nested configuration. All right. So this is a kind of simple example where I'm using a group resource, and I could have multiple resources here. And in fact, I think I have one here. Yeah. So I have a group, and then in this case, for this example, I have a nested group, and it has a couple of resources in it, right? So this allows you to kind of logically group. Let's say that you have a large configuration that goes across network, config, and storage. Then within network, you have multiple resources. You can group those together. And one of the reasons you want to group it is that there's this depends on that you can say, run this part of the configuration first because it depends on the results of this other part, right? And the other one could be a full group which has its own dependencies. Now, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. One one thing I forgot, as we're showing config, we're kind of jumping a little bit ahead, but if you're familiar with ARM templates, then this should look very familiar, right? So one of the things that we decided early on for DCv3 is we want to align with ARM template syntax, because if you're already familiar with ARM, this is the Azure Resource Manager, then transition to DCv3 should be easy, but also because we're aligned with ARM, this allows us an opportunity to integrate with Bicep. So some of these things should be kind of familiar, and this is an expression syntax, which I'll get to later. The other thing that's important about groups, though, because of the way they work, is that these are kind of like scoping rules in PowerShell. So let's see, if I go to this more advanced example of the nested group. So basically, if you need to have dependencies within a group, then the view of that group is only within itself, if that makes sense. So you can't have dependencies that traverse the tree, basically. Question? So the question is comparing that to PowerShell configuration v1. I'm gonna be honest, I am not as I don't have as much knowledge about v1 and configuration as as an engineer. I've done more work on the resource side. I've never actually deployed a configuration myself. So I maybe someone else will have more, or we can talk more about that afterwards, maybe, and figure it out. I don't recall V1 having like a real group concept, but question in the back? Oh, it's Bruce, expert. Yeah. Okay. So you can have configuration within configuration. Yeah. Okay. So it's equivalent to the same thing. All right. Thank you. All right. So we talked about adapter. Right. So adapter, again, is something that anyone can produce and allows you to integrate with a different language. And again, the only ones that we are initially going to do ourselves is going to be PowerShell 7 and Windows PowerShell. Those will be shipped with the package. Import is a new concept. So let me see if I should have one in here. So one of the feedback we got from one of our first party partners is that, again, let's take the situation where you have a large enterprise and you have network storage and compute different configurations for the same server. You may actually have different teams that manage the different configuration for these domains, right? So rather than having this huge Uber configuration document, you may want to have the concept of including the network storage and compute, or XYZ, whatever the case may be. So this allows you one level of indirection. And in this case, this is including this thing called OS info parameters, which is also here. So if I were to run this, see, config, let's do a get. Then basically it's going to resolve the include, and it's going to run this configuration file with these parameters. And maybe I'll talk about parameters now since I've already brought it up a few times. And yeah, so this is, and there's also, let me open this file, which is the actual config being run to explain the output. So let's go over a couple of different things here. So one of the abilities of an ARM template is you can have parameters. So this also kind of allows you to have some of the dynamic mechanism that you kind of asked for earlier, which is, if you have secrets or if you have different things that may adjust certain how the configuration gets applied, you can have parameters. Again, we support all the same types that ARM supports. So you can have strings, numbers, arrays, objects in terms of JSON objects. But you can also have secure parameters, which I'll get to in a bit. But in this particular example, and you can kind of ignore, like some of this stuff is not something you would do, but we do it for test purposes to validate that things work. All right. Because obviously you don't need to concat windows here, but basically you can have default values and you can have like an equivalent of validate set. Again, none of these are all taken from ARM, so they're not stuff that we've necessarily invented ourselves. And in this case, if you run this and you don't provide a parameter value, then it's going to obviously default to Windows. But if you provide it, then it's going to fill in this. So what you see here is called an expression. And one of the functions that we support is the parameters, and this will get the OS info parameter, which is up here, right? So that's how that works. And then we also have a function that we wrote that doesn't exist in ARM because it doesn't make sense in the ARM case of deploying infrastructure. But this is a way to get the environmental variable of a system. In this case, we're getting path, which is why down here, oops, clicked on the wrong thing. You saw this large output because this is actually the path on my computer I'm running right now, right? So it outputted that I'm running. So it tells you it still doesn't include, but it's going to resolve the actual configuration file, which is running this OS info, and it's running Windows, and you see the path, so you can see all that. So let me now show you secure parameters. So the only big difference between a secure parameter and a non-secure parameter is that unless there's a bug, we don't log secure parameters. All right. So normal parameters will get logged. If you do tracing, I think we still log secure parameters for debugging purposes. But again, tracing should be used only as needed, knowing that it's going to have the raw outputs and inputs so that you can actually diagnose what's going on. But you just kind of use it the same way. Now here, the other thing to mention is that expressions also support dot notation. So if you have a JSON object, again, this is very similar to like PowerShell, right? So in this case, we have a, let me just skip here. So this is a parameter file. And so again, this is just following ARM syntax. I probably would have done it a little bit differently, but we're trying to align as close as possible. But basically the parameter says the secure string is called the value. You can kind of see it here, but obviously this is not a true secret. My secret, and then here's an object that has a property called my property and has a value for that. And again, if you go back to the configuration file, then it should emit this echo resources, a test resource. It just echoes back what it gets as input. So if I run this, DC config get, this is secure parameters, DSC YAML. So if I just run this, I think it will not work because I did not provide any of the parameters. So I need to then provide the parameter file, which is here. Example, secure parameters YAML. Oh, hold on. I think -p is not right because this is JSON. Hold on. Oh, it's -f. I think -p is just going to be providing the actual JSON itself. But if I do F for the file, then it's going to read in the parameters file. So you can kind of imagine that you could have different parameter files for different systems using the same configuration. And as you saw, it's just going to get my secret and my secret property. All right, so let's talk about these resource capabilities. So let's go back to listing the resources real quick. So if you see this column called caps, these are all the capabilities that resources can have. So the easiest ones are get, set, and test. Oh, by the way, I should mention, one thing that's different about V3 resources versus prior desired state configuration resources is that you only need to, actually, you don't even need to implement get these days. Everything is optional. All right. So one of the philosophies we have to kind of encourage the community and companies to build resources is to simplify it by having you only implement the capabilities that you really need. So, for example, OS info is not something you could ever set, right? And in fact, it doesn't implement test either. So if I were to, actually, do I have that? Maybe show that in a bit. But basically, you should implement get so that you can do like an audit. If you don't implement test, then we'll do a synthetic test on your behalf, right? So test will still work, but basically the DC engine will take your expected input and it'll take the output. It'll do a get to see what the current state is, and it'll do a direct match. So obviously that doesn't work in all cases. So for example, if you have a package manager where the desired state is to have a package that's versioned between 1 and 2, then the engine doesn't know anything about that. It's just going to compare that string to the output, and it'll probably fail. So in those cases, that resource needs to implement tests so that it can actually understand a version range, for example, or other things that are not exact matches. So export is something that's new for DSCv3. So let me show you from my MacBook. And I will make this bigger. Oops. All right, because I have this brew resource that supports export. So basically, if you're familiar with like reverse DSC, right? So the idea is that you configure this one machine manually, and if it has resources for everything that you configured, then what export will provide is you can take that out, and then you can apply it towards hundreds of other systems, right? So you can configure one manually if you want, validate that is what you want, and then get all the configuration out and apply it elsewhere. So export allows for that. So this is this is a proof of concept. Brew is kind of like apt or winget for macOS, if you will. And basically export here is just enumerating everything that I've installed via Brew. You can kind of see the version and stuff, and I'll talk about this exist in a second. But basically it has to, because it doesn't, the type is exactly the resource type, but the name is a friendly name. So it's just synthetically just adding a number to it. So the other thing to call out here is in DSC prior, you had this concept of ensure, right? You had present and absent. So one of the things that we discussed in the DSCv3 team is when you have ensure, let's say present or absent as an input, that kind of makes sense. But then if you have it as part of the output, it then is a little bit more confusing. All right. So instead, we went with exist, which is the equivalent, but now it makes more sense as both an input and output in our mind, right? And by the way, the exist has an underscore, and basically any property that has an underscore is, you can think of it as a common property in DSCv3. So we define what that means. We have specific syntax and semantics around it, and any resource that supports it needs to conform to that. Right. So if you see a different resource that has exists without the underscore, it could mean whatever that resource decided it to mean. Okay, so now that we talked about exists, let's talk about this set supports exists idea. It sounds weird, but let me go to the registry resource is the best way to explain this. And let me go to the JSON. So again, as we were thinking about how do we make it easy for people to implement resources, again, I wrote the original, I wrote most of the code for the registry resource. But one of the things I did early on to support this underscore exist is basically in the set portion of my registry resource code is I had basically always had to do a check, right? Did the user specify exist? Now exist defaults to true if you don't specify it. But if they specify the false, then I have to go through different logic in my code, right? And you have to do that a lot of places like test and whatnot. So we came with the idea that, hey, what if a resource is implemented delete, right? And we actually, the engine handled the whole exist case, right? So basically, if you have this delete operation, then the capability that you see here for the registry resource has a D, which means it supports delete, which is the equivalent of set, what did I call it? Set supports exists is false, right? So if set supports exists is true, so this is a capability you specify in your resource, then basically when the engine sees that the user has specified underscore exists and it sees that you support it, we'll just pass you the raw inputs and you are expected to handle that yourself. If you don't support it, then we check, do you support delete? If you do, then we're going to change that into a delete operation and call delete on your behalf. The user has no idea because from a set, it's handling all this. If you don't support either one, then we're going to error out, right? Because obviously we can't handle the case of removing something. All right, we talked about what if, and resolve is basically just the operation. So if you have a include resource, let's see, to close all these things. So if you handle the import operation, So this is implemented in DSCx itself. So there should be this included here. Then basically the verb that we decide to have in here is actually resolve. And basically we call this, and then you'll take the inputs, which has a specific syntax, which is the configuration file and the parameter file. And then we ask you to resolve that into a configuration that we then can execute. All right, so we talked about ARM templates. We talked a bit about expressions. Any questions so far before we move on? Okay, so we do have a large set of functions already implemented, but we don't have everything that ARM supports yet. So let me just read the list real quick. So all the functions here, so we have stuff like, adding numbers, base64 encoding, decoding, concatenating. You can kind of see it here. So our goal is to have every ARM function that makes sense for DSC. Some stuff doesn't make sense because it is only makes sense in the ARM context. And so we're not going to have those. And we're definitely open to having, as I mentioned, like the environmental variable is one that only exists in DSC that doesn't exist in ARM. So there may be future ones that make sense to have in DSCv3 and doesn't exist in ARM. So that's where we're going to start diverging a bit. Talk about dot notation. Okay, so we talked about these. Oh, reference. I think I kind of maybe just went over it a bit. One of these. Fine. Oh, actually, let me find an YAML. Okay. Oh, I did have a reference one. So if you, in your configuration, you want to be able to use the output from another resource as input to a different resource, then you use the reference function. And again, this one is a bit more convoluted and complicated only for testing purposes. This is not how I'd expect anyone to actually use it, but this shows that this is going to take the output from the Microsoft OS info. So the resource ID takes both the type and the name, because you can have multiple instances of the same resource, which is up here. And it's actually going to take the actual state and the family, and it's going to tell you the OSs. So if I were to run this here, all right, so these are configurations. Reference. Should tell me the OS is Windows, because it's picking up Windows from right here from the family, right? So obviously this is a very simple example, but if you had more complicated example where the outputs of something is needed for inputs of something else, then you would use an expression with a reference function.
Just a question. Can you do conditional based? So if a condition is met, something is done later based on this one, because that could be.
So the question is, can you do like conditional? There's no ifs or anything like that here. Again, I think our expectation is that you would resolve that through either bicep or I have something at the end, but I'll mention it now. Like, one of the things that we are not planning on supporting is the configuration keyword. All right, so that is only going to be reserved for MOF files. But we are kind of thinking about, and I have an issue open, so if you guys want to help brainstorm on what this may look like, we are thinking about having tooling in PowerShell so that you can do a more dynamic generation of a config file. So imagine that, the config file is just an object, right? So if there's an easy way for you to write a PowerShell script to produce a valid configuration file that DSCx can enact operations upon, then that would be the way to have conditions. But that's just an early idea, so we don't have a idea yet on how exactly that will work.
Because it would make sense, because you can do basic testing and everything, and you can actually see what will happen when you apply it.
Yes, there's value in having conditionals. The thing is, again, we're trying to not deviate too much from ARM right now. The more we deviate, the more complicated it will be for stuff like bicep integration and stuff like that. So, yeah, but it's a higher level, right? So once we have bicep, you'll have that. Yeah. So rather than having it directly in our level of the syntax. All right, so let's jump. Let me see. So I showed the assertion. All right, so assertion is also a new thing in v3. And again, assertion is just a resource, right? So this is implemented as within a DSC executable itself. And the idea here is that you could have checks that you want before you apply the configuration, right? You can kind of think of this as a group policy filter if you're familiar with that. But basically here, I'm going to run this real quick to show you the output. Get. So this will succeed because I'm running on Windows, but if I run the same one on my Mac, config get. So the assertion is that the operating system is Windows. Oh, come on. Oh, it's probably because I changed the assertion to use PowerShell and I don't have that resource here. But in any case, basically what the assertion does, it's a group resource, and any resources you have in here, it's just going to call, oh, actually it's because it's calling registry, which doesn't exist on macOS. But anyways, what assertion does is it's just, no matter what you do, get, set, or test, then all the resources in the assertion, test is going to get called. If anything fails, then the whole thing will fail. Right, and basically that's essentially how it works. And again, it didn't work on my Mac because this resource doesn't exist. All right, I showed the winget one, so let me show WMI. I think WMI, there is a lot of potential for this, although it's still early on, so it's not fully complete yet. But this kind of shows you an example of, if you look at a syntax, again, we may change the namespace. I feel like we should probably have WMI in front versus just the namespace name, but it's just literally calling WMI and it's returning a whole ton of information. So, you could use this in an assertion. The WMI adapter currently doesn't support set. Test would be synthesized, so it would be a direct comparison. But yeah, because WMI has a ton of things in it that could be used, right? So you can now easily mix and match. And by the way, I'll mention that the WMI adapter was actually very simple to write. And the reason for that is that it's written as a PowerShell script. Right, so yeah, so all it is just using get sim instance and stuff like that. It's not, it's a number of lines of code, but not a ton of lines of code to make it work. Again, it is only get is supported currently. All right. So let's talk about this winget example. So I kind of showed it, but let me show you now this a little more detail, this parameters thing. Right. Again, this is ARM syntax. I'm doing a set here, but it doesn't matter. Because all I'm doing is installing, uninstalling calc all the time. I'm probably increasing their numbers. All right, but the idea here, right, like if you remember previously, I had like the security parameters and this OS info parameters. Those are files, but you can also provide it dynamically as part of the command line, but it does require you to pass the actual JSON itself. I think in the future, we'll probably have an ability to prompt for parameters that don't have default values, and also maybe have a simplified name value pair kind of syntax like PowerShell. What was that? You could. So the question is, can you pipe it into DSC? So the thing is, right now, DSC, you can pipe in the configuration document, but you can't pipe in more than one thing right now. There's a separate issue I have open that where it may make sense for different software that's integrating with DSC, like for example, in the future, Azure Machine Config, to have one instance of DSC that's long running. So I think we'll probably have at some point, I don't know if it's going to be part of 3.0 or 3.1, have like a server mode where basically we just have it running not exactly as a service, but kind of like a long running process. And you can send multiple types of JSON input to do multiple operations, right? In which case you can stream a whole bunch of stuff for different configurations. You want to do get, sets, and tests and whatever. So that is an idea that we're floating when that team gets around to integrating with V3. We did talk about secure parameters. Okay, metadata. So, in fact, you should be able to see it here. So, as part of the output from DSCv3, there's a few things that I kind of maybe glossed over, but let me talk about the output here real quick. We do inject certain metadata. So, for example, you can kind of see this is the version of DSC itself. We tell you the operation. The execution type will basically be either actual or what if right now. And we do tell you like the start and end times for both the configuration, but also we tell you the duration of a particular resource. So you can kind of know where things are slow. And we also tell you the security context. So this tells you whether or not stuff is running as administrator or basically non-admin. And in fact, I think I have an example here. Here's a require admin. So let me show real quick. Let's see, config get. So I am not admin right now. Right, and it tells me elevated security context required. So this is a very simple way so that in your configuration, you can specify the security context as either elevated or in the non-admin case restricted. And if you're not of that type, then the configuration won't succeed. One of the changes we'll probably do in the future is that if you are elevated and you run a restricted context, then we could actually create a restricted process to run on your behalf so you don't have to de-elevate. We talked about those. Okay, so we kind of talked a bit about the editor experience already. So I'm actually kind of towards the end. Any questions before I get back to the slides? Yes.
Well, do I understand it correctly that you are preparing to be able to integrate with ARM, or does that function already, and who is executing it? Is that the machine configuration team, or how does that work?
Okay, so the question is, with all this talk about ARM, besides the benefit of Bicep, does that mean that we're going to integrate with ARM? So one of the goals of this project is that within an ARM template, you could have nested DSCv3 configuration directly, right? And the way we would actually enact that is via Azure Machine Config. So you've already jumped to that conclusion, yes. They are one of our partners. Yes, the Azure Machine Config right now is, they're busy with some other work right now. They're one of my peer teams, but we are working together so that eventually, I don't have a time frame for them, I can't speak on their behalf, but they will integrate with V3. They currently work with V2, in which case we will have the full, ideally, ARM integration. So within an ARM infrastructure, you can also configure individual nodes. Question?
Does that mean that you can have an ARM template that deploys to VM and then configures to VM?
So the question is, does that mean you can have an ARM template that deploys a VM and configures the VM? The answer is, that's the goal. All within the same template. We're kind of far from that right now, but. Question?
If you have existing class-based resources for DSC, they will just show up if you list them, or with the enumerate from the modules, you have to put in the modules, right?
Okay, so the question is for class-based resources, how does discovery happen, essentially, or how to get... okay, so actually, maybe I glossed over this a little bit too quickly. Okay, so let me go back to running DC resource list. Oops. So I'm going to get to the PowerShell side in a bit, but the way DC resource list works is actually going to just traverse your path environmental variable, all the segments, and it's going to find these manifest JSON files. One of the things that we're hoping in the future is that a lot of the executables you use today themselves are the resource. Like you don't have a separate executable for the resource, right? So if you're using, let's say Docker kubectl, or more likely Azure CLI or PowerShell PWSH, like I have an issue open that we'll do this eventually, as that itself will be a DC resource. So you can configure it, right? So we're just going to search the path for the executables. We're going to find these JSON or YAML manifests, and then those will show up here. So adapters handle however they do discovery by themselves. So when you enumerate, so let's go back to, I think I have, like this one, right? I'm going to get rid of this filter because I don't have this installed on this particular system. But when I call this, then I'm calling the adapter and say, hey, give me your list operation, and it will do its own discovery. So in the case of PowerShell adapter, it is doing what it normally would do, which is traversing PS module path opening up the modules, looking for classes and stuff like that. So this one doesn't take very long because I don't have much. I only have the winget stuff installed on this machine. But that's how that works, right? So when you actually have a configuration and it includes PowerShell like this, right? Then DSC is going to first find the adapter via the normal path route. And then it's now, when it needs to call this stuff, it's actually going to call into that to discover via PS module path. So it kind of just hands off that work. This actually brings up another point I didn't mention. So for Windows PowerShell, it does require PS desired state configuration module v2. For PowerShell 7, one of the things that we've done in the PowerShell adapter is we completely removed dependency on the PS desired state configuration module altogether. All right, so you don't even need that. If you're only working with PowerShell 7 and you're only using the PS adapter for DSCv3, you don't even need the PS desired state configuration module anymore. Again, that also means that we only support class-based resources in PowerShell 7. And by the way, I think we may have already added export capability on the PowerShell 7 side of the adapter. So for classes, so you do get set test and export as optional. And we have no plans of backporting that to 5.1. So that means that script-based resources can't do it. 5.1 can't do it. Yes?
You have V2 resources already. You can use them in the 3.
So the question is, if you have DSCv3 resources already, you can use it with V3. The answer is yes. So again, we have both the PowerShell 7 adapter and Windows PowerShell adapter. So if you're using, let's say, the old WMI binary-based resources, then you should use the Windows PowerShell adapter. If you have a class-based resource that you know works under PowerShell 7, you can choose either one. If you have a script-based resource, you have to use the Windows PowerShell adapter. So we're making a very fine cut there between the two systems. And one of the reasons is so that we can remove dependency on PS DSC module. We'll go here first.
So you're running against local host. Does it work over network already?
So the question is, everything I showed is running on a local system. Is there any remoting capability? So there's nothing remote here. The expectation is that you would use preferably like OpenSSH to do remoting. One of the things I'll mention now, but I have it in my slide when I go back to it, is I think for 3.1, so post 3.0, we'll probably have a LCM again, so like an LCM-like thing. So we'll probably have DSC running as an agent, in which case we'll have stuff like push-pull and things like that. I think there's a question over here.
So I noticed an export is an optional way to move forward with your custom resource.
Yes.
How hard is it to implement?
Okay, so the question is, export is optional, and how hard is it to implement? So it really depends on what domain you're implementing. For example, if you're doing like a network adapter, as long as you can enumerate all the network adapters and emit it per your schema, that's all you need to do. There's nothing special here, right? So if you remember like this brew example. No. So the question is it using get? There's no... So one of the things we thought about early is, can we reuse get as a way to get like a cheap export? And the answer is no. It didn't quite work out so well. So that's why we have export as a completely separate operation. Now, with that said, and I don't think it works today because I think I have an issue open for this as well. In the future, there's a lot of issues right now still, right? But if you have a configuration that has a mix of resources that support get, and by the way, get requires a filter, right? You have to like, for example, the registry, you don't want to export the whole registry. You may, but it wouldn't make sense to you to do that. But you may have certain parts of it you want to export, right? So one of the things that I think makes sense is that if you have a configuration where you specify parts of the registry and it does a get, but you want to do an export on the full configuration, then that should work, right? Because it's the equivalent in that case, right? Okay. Other questions? Yes.
A question about secrets. In the one example, you had an extra YAML file where you had the secrets inside.
Yes.
So how is it in the clear text then saved on my drive when I save, or how can you protect it then so that?
Sure. So the question is, how do you protect secrets that are stored like in a parameters file? So again, like, there's two things you should really think about, right? There's secure parameters, and these can be passed in different ways. Like you could have a script or something else like machine config that's actually passing it via the command line at runtime, right? So it's retrieving it from key vault and then providing it at runtime. in which case it's ideally encrypted all the way except when it gets past the DSCx. Now, in the case where you do have secrets in a parameters file, like I have in this demo file, then presumably this is actually not on the same system, right? This is stored somewhere else, like in Key Vault, that you're retrieving dynamically at runtime and passing it in once it's decrypted. Now, I'll keep saying this, but there is an issue open about how we do integration with something like secret management. Although secret management, we need something that's not dependent on PowerShell, so we may have like a native secret management kind of story in the future. But I think what we have with parameters is probably good enough for now for most cases, because this is how ARM does it as well.
That's why you should actually pipe parameters instead of because then it wouldn't be tied to any. You wouldn't have to pass it anywhere.
So the statement was, if you were to support piping for parameters, then at least that'd be another way to avoid having maybe on disk or something like that, right? So something we can. I suggest open an issue, please. I'm very right now. We're still in development. Yeah. Okay. Because right now it's because we're not done yet, we're still very open to changes, right? So this is a key time to get that feedback because once we hit 3.0 and changes happen, those are all breaking changes at that point.
Maybe you fetch directly from an LCM provider by people.
I'm sorry?
You fetch directly from people or a similar secret provider.
From Key Vault. So I think the question is, can you get it directly from Key Vault? Okay. So ARM templates do allow this, but ARM is running in an environment where it's connected to Azure. Yeah. So for example, one thing that I've thought of, and I don't think I have an issue open for this because I don't know if it's a good idea yet, is that, remember, we can have custom functions in DSC that don't exist in ARM. So we could have a get secret function that is the equivalent of the secret management module in PowerShell, right? So now, I don't want to necessarily say, because remember, this is open source and cross-platform. I don't want to say it's Key Vault only, but we could have something like get secret, you provide the secret name, and then you have separate from DSC registered vaults, which one could be Azure Key Vault, one could be Credman, whatever the case may be, and we retrieve it that way, right? So that's something I'm very open to.
Okay.
Question in the back?
DCv only have the concept of a node.
Okay, so the question is, in V1 configuration, you have a concept of a node. Does it exist here? The answer is no. So again, I think once we have bicep integration and also this other thing where we may have tooling in PowerShell to dynamically generate static configuration, you would have the equivalent at that point. Question?
So you mentioned bicep, you mentioned
Yes.
completely irrelevant for me because I'm working primarily on-prem. You say 2 times that you may have the tooling. Can you commit to that? Are you sort of saying that happening? Because for me, that personally, that's really not irrelevant if I don't have a powerful tooling to generate this.
Okay. So I'm going to summarize. So the thing is, your interest is not in the cloud and more on-prem. And how can I commit to certain tooling, and what tooling will that be to support on-prem? So I think what we are committed to is supporting bicep. Now, even with bicep, you can use the bicep language to generate something you only use on-prem. So it depends on whether or not you actually like bicep, okay? I think the PowerShell tooling, the reason I can't commit to it right now is that we don't know what it looks like. I think we're committed to the idea, all right? We definitely, I still own the PowerShell team, so I want to support PowerShell, although this project is also decoupled and doesn't require PowerShell. But, I think most resources to start with, almost all resources that exist today are written in PowerShell. I think most resources in the near future will probably be written in PowerShell. It's just easier. So definitely we want to continue to support the PowerShell community. So I would say I'm very committed to having something. I just don't know what that thing looks like yet.
Yeah, because if you start something, it's open source.
Yes.
People can expand on what you envision it to be.
Yes.
I can write something myself, obviously, that will generate it. It's not that hard because it's just generating JSON and PowerShell CZ.
That's all it is.
But the question is I don't want to start building something, then you will say, oh, well, actually, we don't like it like this. We'll rather have it differently, this different direction we want to take, and then people can actually follow the direction that you. It can be as simple as just stating then some in default what you think it should do.
So let me simplify. No, it's fine. Again, going back to the PowerShell integration and using PowerShell script as a way to kind of generate configurations. The fundamental thing that you really, like you mentioned, it's very easy today in PowerShell to work with JSON, right? You work as a PS custom object and you convert to JSON, you're done, right? The only missing piece really is the schema, where if you don't get it right, then you don't know until you kind of at deployment time or other validation time. So the simplest case might simply be, hey, we have a type in PowerShell that matches the schema, and you use that, right? And I don't think that's necessarily the best experience, but that could be the 0.1 experience, right? But when we talk about stuff like, parameters, expression, functions, I think maybe there's some more integration we could do with PowerShell to make it so that it's more natural for a PowerShell user versus someone who's not familiar with ARM. That's where things get complicated and needs more thinking. I would encourage, because the fundamental format of configuration at the end of the day is JSON, I don't think there's a problem in my mind to have different people build different tooling that, produces the same output, right? Because even if the PowerShell team comes up with a proposal, that may not fit what everyone's needs are. It will be open source, so you guys can always submit your own PRs anyways, but question?
Maybe it's a little bit unrelated, but it is in regards to DSC. So DSC is a great technology to use, but we're having some trouble to manage and maintain these things because you've got a lot of configurations to maintain, etc. You've got Azure Machine Config, you've got Azure Guest Policy. What do you consider to be the best way forward to manage and maintain?
All right, so the question is, there's a lot of different technologies, even within Azure, for configuration and policy. What do I recommend? I don't think I am the right person or expert to answer that question, to be honest. Yeah, I've never used it myself. As an engineer, I built a platform, but I am the stuff I use is more like Azure DevOps pipelines and stuff like that. I can answer those questions, but I don't maintain systems myself. So I think maybe other people in the room might have better answers for that.
That's also one of the questions, because in DSC you have a lot of dependencies and resources. If you write the DSCv3, you have all the modules and everything you need to provision. This looks like kind of a big sprawl for me, because you have a lot of dependency management prior to actually applying the configuration. So will there be any kind of how to fix off those dependencies before? Because in the V1 you can have all the modules on the pull server and it'll be like automatic and it will update, and everything was just. That was really nice to have. But here I could see you need to have a lot of other things in place, especially if you want to go devices, endpoint devices.
Yes.
That would be a barrier for this to being a success somehow.
Sure. So the question is really about dependency management. So if you have a large set of machines, then how do you make sure all the resources you need are on those things and the dependencies for those resources and all that stuff, right? So I think there's two answers. Again, in the future, we will have an agent and that will resolve some of those problems, but that's in the future. In the interim, again, I do have an open issue on this right now, is we want to have the idea of having a zip file format, right, where you can package everything you need, including the configuration, the resources, those dependencies. You deploy the config, and then ideally you don't even unpack it because it won't be called zip. It will be called .dsc. Who knows what we'll call it? Something like that, right? But it'll be equivalent of like a nupkeg if you're familiar with that. So the schema will be defined, and it also means that, for example, again, you can look at the issue, but some of the ideas would be if you use this as a mechanism to deploy configuration, then we won't even look outside of that zip package for resources with the exclusion of anything that comes with DSC, right? So that way it's a little bit more secure. So governance and security and stuff like that is top of mind. So again, that may not happen in 3.0 timeframe, and more likely happens. But I think that type of problem where you have large scale deployments and dependency management is something that is on top of mind. Question?
So currently you have a deployment script or film script, right?
Yeah.
So for testing, currently you just need to have that sorted and redeploy that device.
So you're saying, okay, so if you already have all the resources, then you just redeploy the config?
You probably have a build script. So when you need to get that up and running on your device, you run the build script. It gets all the different resources downloaded.
Oh, you're okay. So you're proposing a potential solution today is to have within your script that it creates the image or whatever that it's kind of like your Docker file, whatever. You have all the resources. Yes. So you can solve it today for yourself with existing technologies by having your own. If you already have a build script that creates the image and deploys it at that moment in time, include all the resources you need. Any other questions? Let's go in the back. Bruce first. Why am I doing this? All right. So that's a great question. So the way this project actually started was actually feedback from the Azure machine config when they were called Azure guest config at the time. A lot of their customers love the idea of DSC, and they wanted to extend it for their own domains for resources areas that resources don't exist, right? But their main feedback was, guess what? They're not PowerShell users. They're definitely not PowerShell class authors. They're maybe like a Python house or something like that, right? So they said, how do we participate? And we didn't have an answer, right? So then this started a whole conversation. All right, what if we supported other languages in DSC? What would that look like? So it kind of evolved from there to what it is today. So this came out of customer feedback. Yes.
My question is like the problem with DSCv1 is that when you like the thing that you referred to is that when you have resources that you need to use, you actually have them. You need them up front. You cannot really start configuration without a certain resource. It feels like this one wouldn't be the case, right? You can just have probably a sequence where you first install all resources that you need and then you start using them. Would that work? Or
it is. Okay, so the question is the order of dependencies, whether or not you need to have everything up front. So I would say it is possible. I'm not sure if I would say it's recommended. Like you could have a okay, so again, I'll mention this again. I have an issue I opened up, and again, I don't know if it's a good idea, which is what I called it is DSC resource. All right, and basically the idea is that in the configuration, you define all the resources you need with maybe the repository credentials, hashes, whatever you need to check, right? And you only need to deploy that, and it would actually get everything that you need to actually finish up. Now, I'm still not sure if that's a good idea, to be honest, but I have it open as an issue for discussion. Question. Yes, it is. That's where it's kind of like the concept came from. The question was, is this equivalent to like DSCv1 pull server? Yes. But again, it hasn't been completely thought through. And my main concern is really from a security perspective, because functionally it's not, it makes sense, but I think from a security standpoint, doesn't make sense versus like if you had like a zip package that you've completely validated, you've signed and all this stuff, that just seems more secure, but there's downsides and upsides to both approaches. Is there a hand back there? All right. Yes.
What is your idea how to record all the nodes you have to a single instance, so you have an overview of what your configurations and then reporting?
Okay. So the question is really about reporting, especially at scale. So my answer today would be Azure Machine Config once they integrate with V3. Like we're not. The intent of this platform is not to encroach into that space. Now, because we're developing this platform not just for Azure Machine Config, although they're one of our primary partners right now for at scale in Azure. But I would imagine Chef, Puppet, Ansible, all these other folks will probably integrate. And some of the stuff we're doing in the design makes it easier for them to integrate than they did with V2. So our hope is that builds the whole ecosystem so you have choices. Other questions? Yes.
I love everything about this except for the name. You should choose another name because it's nothing to do with this. It's so confusing for people from outside because they know what DSC is and it's getting their head around it.
So the question or statement is, why didn't we choose a different name from DSC? It is not an evolution of DSCv2, basically. So I think one is there is in my mind, there's a connection to DSC, right? We can use DSCv2 resources. We still have get set tests, but we have more than that now. So there's a connection there. I think the concepts are similar, although the syntax is wildly different. Coming up with a new name has its own problems as well, because now you're just reteaching everything. And to be honest, if I had a different name in this presentation, I'd be mentioning DSC a lot.
The methodology is the same.
Yeah.
And some kind of a cheat sheet or something where you have some really, really easy overview because you are lagging with a lot of documentation. I know because you're building it right now, but for people from outside, it's really frustrating because if we speak with some of you guys, you have so much knowledge, and it's so super confusing for us from the outside and really understanding what are all the dependencies.
Oh, forget the Sony had a camera. All right, let me put in more words here. All right. So the question or statement is really about documentation. So I know that Mikey, and I don't need to make this bigger because I don't think you're going to read it here. So here's what I would say. So right now, the documentation that we have published is more on the reference side and technical. I know that Mikey has in his backlog to have more of a onboarding tutorial or movement from DSCv2 to V3 kind of documentation. So that doesn't exist yet. That is on the backlog for him. We all know this is important because we expect developers probably to read this, but we don't expect end users to read this.
If you have a mindset which is not like this, you really don't get all the dependencies and all the new type of resource.
Yes.
It's just a high-level overview, perhaps something that explains it.
Absolutely. So definitely more documentations coming. Again, if you have specific requests, you can open it up in the... So we have a separate PowerShell docs repo, but you can open it in the DSC repo, and Mikey sees those. Question?
One question. Since you want to be agent independent and you are considering an LCM or Gate of Line, how are you going to be handling conflict management? If one team would, for example, install calc and the other one can move it.
Yes. So things like that. Okay. So the question is, once we have an agent, how to resolve a lot of problems that agents have, including conflict resolution or, GPO has the resulting set of policies kind of problem. I'll be honest, it's too far ahead that I haven't really thought a lot about it. Well, it's a problem that I'm aware of. I mean, just RSOP is, for me, the primary case. We'll have to figure that out when we get there. Demetrius?
So with Winged, we're actually logging configurations we run. And then we're going to attempt to do a comparison. But we expect there's going to be cases where a different resource is doing something conflicting. We're not going to have a way to reason about that.
No.
So the statement is about Winged configure, and they have a solution of comparison, but obviously that's not going to cover all cases. Bruce?
Comment that in DSCv1, the idea after you ran the script was that you had a static document, and each resource in the document had a key property of the file that would be added and so on. So if you had multiple people supplying those things, you can do a relatively simple analysis and look for colliding resource.
Okay, so the statement from Bruce is in V1, you had a attribute on properties called a key, so you could do analysis ahead of time to know if they conflict. So in V3, we do have a proposal on defining properties as keys. The engine's not looking at that right now at all, partly because it's not an agent. But in the future, we can certainly leverage that kind of model to at least know ahead of time before applying whether or not there's conflicts. Let's go back there first. Oh, why don't we do this? Let's go back to my slides because I covered that. And I think we're getting close to end of time. There we go. Okay, so let me just quickly cover the key takeaways for anyone who, I know there was a ton of information that was given out, but the key things is V3 enables a new resource ecosystem, make it easier to build resources, particularly for non-PowerShell users. There's a whole bunch of new resource capabilities, even for PowerShell class-based resources, this is specifically to export. And this is modernized on JSON with future bicep support. I just noticed the closed captioning. All right, so let's talk about the timeline, which is the question, 3.0 and beyond. So for 3.0, currently we're targeting having a general availability date late Q3 of this year. All right. Again, we're not date driven. We're going to be quality driven, but we do want to have, if we don't have a date, it'll just go on forever. So this is what we're targeting right now. And then beyond 3.0, so 3.1 ideas. So again, bicep isn't going to come as part of 3.0. I mentioned the PowerShell tooling for author configurations. And DCX as an agent is potentially all showing up in 3.1. Again, it kind of depends. We have to prioritize. And again, I expect that as we do integration with like machine config, they're going to have a ton of feedback, and we'll have to see how to prioritize that as well. And also figure out the publishing discovery part. It will probably use, although I mentioned ACR, it would presumably work with any container registry or ORAS type of solution. All right. And I think that's the end. Other questions I didn't get to, or yes?
How does error reporting work? Like, for example, now we have our MOV files in an Azure automation account. The nodes connect to it, get the MOV file, apply it, and then report back, did everything work or which did not work. And if I do it now, I have the files locally on my machine, let the task scheduler, for example, run it every hour, and now there's an error, what else, how do we get
Okay, so the question is really how do you get errors out of configuration? But your example is a bit more complicated with like Azure and whatnot. So I'm going to take this as two parts. In the case of DSC Engine, one of the things that we try to do, again, this is talking with the Azure guest config team on stuff that they've had to do before. So we're putting, like, for example, they do a get ahead of time to know whether or not they even need, like, we're actually putting that into the engine. So the higher level tooling doesn't have to worry about those things, right? And in addition, like, you can see there's a had errors, and this would be true or false. And they're also, one of the best practices in DSCv2 is to have like reasons messages to kind of explain stuff. So now we roll it up under messages here. In this case, this succeeded, so there's no messages. Now, for within the cloud and more at scale, then that's really the responsibility of like Azure Machine Config or Chef, Puppet, Ansible, whatever the case may be. Any other questions? Otherwise, you can get in front of lunch.
Just a quick one.
Yeah.
You mentioned the support for the export and other methods. Is this something that we just need to add to our classes?
Okay, so the question is about export, and let me see. I don't know if I actually have a good example here, but maybe I do. Well, I have a test file. Actually, let me do it this way. No. Okay, so the short answer, I don't know if I can find an example because I don't think we have a real world example yet. That's why, these are all tests. But so in a PowerShell class, again, this only works with the PowerShell 7 adapter, not with the Windows PowerShell adapter, is that in your PowerShell class, just like how you have get, set, and test, you would just have export. And you just return instances of your schema, and that's it. Very simple. Basically, it's like, if you heard of the term like get all, it's kind of like that, right? Just give me everything that makes sense that be configured. All right. Any other questions? And by the way, you can always, if you don't want to ask in this forum, you can always find me offline and ask me those questions as well. All right. Thanks, everyone.